Yet again, the multiversal madness has caused me to review an X-Men movie that's out of order of release. 10 years after Days of Future Past. Besides X2 or Logan, this, I think, is the best that the franchise ever put out. Easily in my top 10 comic book movies of all time. X-Men Days of Future Past is directed by Bryan Singer, starring just about everybody that I'm not even going to go into the list of names. We all know who they are if you've been following the X-Men movies for the last 24 years. In the dystopian 2023, which was actually last year, that's kind of crazy to think about, a certain type of robots called the Sentinels that are programmed to adapt to mutant powers have taken over the globe and are wiping out all of mutant kind or any human being that holds the genetic code of mutation. Basically like Skynet wiping out all of the human race in Terminator. And in a last-ditch effort to change history, Wolverine is sent back in time by Kitty Pryde in order to stop a certain event that will change the course of history forever. This movie came out right when I was starting movie reviews here on YouTube. I did a review back in the day, but I deleted it because I didn't really like how it looked or how I sounded. Hopefully you guys understand I was a very different person back then. And I reviewed some of the X-Men movies at the time, but I took those reviews down too, which again, for those same reasons. I was trying to get my foot in the door in this capacity, so to speak, and doing my homework when I saw the trailer for Days of Future Past, and it looked really, really good. And I'll never forget hearing the musical cues ending with older Charles talking to younger Charles saying, "We need you to hope again." Come to think of it, this movie I think was the first of the legacy sequels that we've been getting for the past decade, from the likes of Force Awakens, Top Gun Maverick, Spider-Man No Way Home, and amongst others, where we see older characters from a previous iteration of a certain property meeting up with the new characters of the current generation. There's probably another example or two that I don't know about or don't remember. In my experience anyway, this was technically, I think, the first legacy sequel. This was probably the biggest comic book movie of 2014 besides The Winter Soldier. You also had the likes of Bryan Singer returning to the steering wheel, correcting all the mistakes that were being made after his departure. We can talk about the other two movies that he did afterward, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. With X-Men 3, there was a lot of people who weren't really thrilled with certain creative choices made by Brett Ratner. And while Bryan Singer had a story credit with X-Men First Class, I didn't really love that movie, but I thought it was fine. I think it got the job done, but it didn't really have that emotional heft that Bryan Singer brought to the first two movies and this one. And of course, with him back behind the camera, this feels a lot more like the X-Men that fans had remembered from the early 2000s. Like he just breezed right through the door and said, "All you guys messed up might work, now I'm taking it back." If you somehow have never seen Days of Future Past, please watch it if you haven't already, or if you don't care about spoilers, have at it. So the opening of this movie is a very haunting and eerie one, where we see dystopian New York City of Sentinels setting up labor camps for human and mutant survivors, which is very reminiscent of the Holocaust, especially when they're marked, just like Holocaust prisoners were marked like cattle. It's a really great way of setting the tone for what's been happening between the Wolverine from 2013 and what's going on in the current time. It's a very dour situation that nobody's really happy about, but the humanity of the characters is still intact. And the Sentinels are effectively presented as a very scary adversary in the way that they're able to adapt to mutant powers like Bishop, Warpath, or Colossus. And the only way that they can avoid being killed by the Sentinels is if Kitty Pryde sends a certain character back in time to warn them before the Sentinels come in. But in a last-ditch effort, they have to send somebody back 50 years in order to stop all this from ever happening. Because as is explained by Xavier in a somewhat slightly overdone expository scene, Mystique was responsible for the death of Bolivar Trask. He was doing research on mutant kind. She got her revenge and they experimented on her, and that led to the creation of the Sentinels being able to adapt to mutant powers. And the only way to stop the war from happening is if they stop her from killing Trask. But the only one who's capable of being able to go back in time without being physically shredded apart is Wolverine, since he has an accelerated healing factor. Kitty Pryde, played by Ellen Page, or now Elliot Page, is able to send him back 50 years into the past. I also really do like how they make it clear that this is a last-ditch effort to stop everything from happening, because they won't be able to send Wolverine back a few days before the Sentinels come in. It's an all-or-nothing scenario. And while it's easy to get annoyed that Hugh Jackman's Wolverine is being used once again as a main focus, with a few exceptions, he's probably the only character that we, as the audience, have gotten to know over the last decade or so since the franchise started in 2000. But Hugh Jackman has proven himself to be a very solid actor, a more than solid actor, actually. And even the fans that are very frustrated over Wolverine's constant use in the film, even they have admitted that they like him. He clearly has a lot of passion and love for the character of Logan, and he's the only actor in the genre of comic book movies to still be playing the same character over 2 decades. Why do you think he's coming back as a variant of his character in Deadpool 3 later this year? The transition of him waking up in 1973, I think, is a really good use of fish out of water humor, as he realizes that he's sleeping in a waterbed and he doesn't have any clothes on, which I know a lot of ladies will just go crazy over. In fact, I remember specifically back when I saw this in theaters, my mom was just, well, she couldn't help herself. I'm not gay, not that there's anything wrong with it, but I don't blame her because he is a good-looking guy, and it makes me jealous that I'm not as good-looking as he is. I turned to her and said, Mom, calm yourself. Calm yourself, please. But his main goal is to find a young Charles Xavier and convince him of everything that's going to happen in the future and that he's from the future. And also to expect some resistance from Charles Xavier, as is described by his older counterpart, Patrick Stewart, that he was a very different person and that he didn't have his powers in 1973. And at the time when I saw this, having seen First Class, I thought, huh? What does that mean? But he meets up with Charles Xavier at his mansion, which has now been abandoned, with Nicholas Hoult returning as Beast, provoking him into a fight, albeit a brief one, by making him turn into the Beast, which I think the design looks a lot better than it did the last time around. But as we get reacquainted with Charles Xavier, it's revealed that he's been taking drugs in order to suppress his powers. Hank has been doing the same thing, but gives himself enough to keep him balanced. Charles takes too much of it, so that way he doesn't have any of his powers and he can walk again and not hear any voices from other people. After losing Raven, his friend Eric, and all the students and teachers that went to Vietnam and got killed or wounded, this guy has practically lost everything, and he feels like he has nothing left to live for. But it's not done in a way where you beg the audience for sympathy and empathy. Thanks to Bryan Singer's direction, the writing from Simon Kinberg, which is almost consistently perfect throughout, and James McAvoy's great performance, he manages to get the viewer's sympathy in all the right ways. Also giving us some insight on Charles' backstory and how he was able to discover his powers. Other people have talked about how this movie is very similar to Terminator, and those comparisons are definitely present. I think in a way this is very similar to the first Back to the Future. When Marty goes back to visit a young Doc Brown, Doc is not really buying that he's from 1985 until he tells him a story that only he, Doc, would know about it. Logan has a very similar effect on Charles Xavier that only he and the other person would know about. And the ending, I think, is also very similar to Back to the Future, but we'll get to that later. Both Back to the Future and Terminator involve time travel and changing the future for the better or worse, so to speak. And the time travel element, I think, is also handled very effectively. I mean, time travel is not easy to pull off. Even if you manage to show a good amount of attention to detail, there's always going to be somebody out there that's going to find holes in your logic that you create. There's a couple of things that kind of leave me scratching my head, but it's not so big to the point where it takes me out of the movie or anything. We'll talk about those as we go on, but I think it's done well enough for me to not really get so bogged down with all those little details, because at the end of the day, they're really just nitpicks. Even though Charles is very resistant to join Logan in this endeavor to break Eric out of prison, which is revealed that he's been held inside the Pentagon for JFK's assassination, he eventually decides to cooperate, while also recruiting a certain character named Peter Maximoff along the way, played by Evan Peters, who many would consider to be one of the many highlights of this movie. And the use of Quicksilver in this movie is done perfectly. Probably should have put a disclaimer in here earlier. I'm not really familiar with the X-Men comics or the Marvel Universe in general, as far as like the intricate details of the comics or anything. I know basic stuff. I've done some research through Wikipedia. I know that's not really respectable, I guess, if some people don't like how I do my research. I know enough about it to understand what's going on. Knowing the comics does help, yes, but the movies also, I think, for the most part, do a good job of selling you on what the essence of the characters are. And you could say the same thing about Quicksilver, although I'm not really sure if this is entirely accurate, because in the following year, we saw Aaron Taylor Johnson's portrayal in Age of Ultron, and that didn't really last too long because of how well received this version was. Kind of a bummer, but he did kind of show up in WandaVision. We're veering off topic here, but I do really like the use of Quicksilver in here, and it's not so insufferably annoying like a Jar Jar Binks or anything. He injects the right amount of humor when it's necessary. It's kind of like the Joker in The Dark Knight when that one detective goes, "You killed 6 of my friends," and he goes... And I've always loved this little moment. I wish they followed through on it properly in the next one.
They told me you control metal. You know, my mom once knew a guy who could do that.
And I think he might have started to figure it out until Charles comes in, but I think it's really good at letting you know, oh, wait a minute. Are these two father and son? Leading us to probably one of the best scenes in the whole movie, where we see everything slow down as the guards are coming in ready to shoot, and Quicksilver moves around so fast, moving all the bullets out of the way, positioning the guards' arms towards their faces in a way that they could hit each other. One of the funniest scenes I've ever witnessed in film in my life. And while I do like the sequence that he has in X-Men Apocalypse, this one I think was more special, because up until then, we hadn't really seen something like that in film. While we're on the subject of Magneto, played by two of some of the greatest actors we've seen in the business, I don't really like to pick favorites. I think Michael Fassbender is the best actor to play Magneto. McKellen has done wonders playing this character. I will not complain about that at all. Me personally, I think Fassbender has the edge. Ever so slightly, though. Just like in X-Men 2, when he gets enough of the information and decides to fulfill his own agenda, he has enough of the information that he needs and decides to kill her right on the spot. Completely unapologetic, and thanks to the writing and direction, Michael Fassbender sells it 100%. And to rewind for a little bit, when they're on the plane and they're having their awkward reunion, like their dynamic in First Class, which I think is probably the movie's strongest point, is that friendship/rivalry between the two. We, the audience, managed to get a good understanding of both sides, how Xavier felt abandoned by Eric, but then also Eric feels the same way about McAvoy when he lost all of his friends. Magneto just stands completely still and unfazed by all the destruction he's causing. I gotta admit, I did kind of shudder a little bit with fear, just watching Michael Fassbender exude that intimidation. This guy clearly knows what he's doing. But another small moment that I've always really liked, and I found it to be really sad upon rewatch, in a good way, is when Eric starts to express sorrow for what happened with Charles in the years since they managed to go their own separate paths after Cuba. And while he does offer his apology, Charles kind of brushes it off saying, you know what, let's just play chess. Little nuances in Michael Fassbender's performance, you could tell that he feels kind of hurt by his refusal to accept his apology. And I think Magneto genuinely does mean it. Even though he is going to do what he feels is right, there is still a sense of care and compassion that he feels for his friend. And as we mentioned earlier, with Mystique being the catalyst or a key ingredient in the start of the war, Jennifer Lawrence returns once again as the character. And I personally think that this is her best use of the character Mystique in all the movies that she's appeared in. First Class, I think she had the emotional heft, maybe not quite the physicality. In that movie, I can excuse it because that was the genesis of the mutant kind X-Men team thing, so to speak. So I was alright with her not really having that type of commanding presence, and she wasn't fully comfortable being in her own skin at that point in time. Now that she's gone her own dark path, even away from Eric Lenscher, now Jennifer Lawrence has been able to kind of spread her wings at this point. Even the most diehard haters of Jennifer Lawrence can admit she manages to sell it 100%. I know you're probably waiting for me to ogle over her, because anyone who knows me, you know how I feel about Jennifer Lawrence.
Oh, my heart! My heart!
Due to her losing some of her friends that we met in First Class who were experimented on by Bolivar Trask, she's on the war path to get her revenge. She manages to sneak into the Paris Peace Accords by posing as a North Vietnamese colonel. In the scene where she seduces the colonel by revealing her true mutant powers.
What's the matter, baby? You don't think I look pretty like this?
I sure do. So she makes her way into the Paris Peace Accords. Charles, Hank, Logan, and Eric arrive to stop her, and she manages to jump out the window in her mutant form to everybody's horror and confusion. And what I really like about this sequence is the use of the 3:4 aspect ratio in a sense of watching this stuff happen on the news in real time. And it's really good at making the audience feel like we're actually experiencing this for the first time, because up until then, in this universe of the X-Men, people have heard rumors about mutants, but they're not entirely sure if they're real. But after seeing this, any and all doubts are now gone. On top of that, you have Logan seeing Colonel Stryker and bringing back all the memories that he has of the Weapon X program, accidentally stabbing Kitty Pryde in the side, Charles trying to calm Logan down with Hank trying to stop Eric, but then getting entangled in Magneto's trap with everybody watching him. Couldn't help but really feel a sense of sympathy. Even though he's managed to control his mutation for the most part, there is still that sense of embarrassment and shame that he feels over the way he looks. Now, I'm not too familiar with the character of Beast, but if I'm correct, any comic book fans can tell me if this is right. I think that's a key aspect of the character and how he feels like he's a monster, but eventually he does learn to accept that that's part of who he is. Also, what Charles says to Logan as he's trying to calm him down.
You're on acid. Somebody gave you really bad acid.
Obviously, Joss Whedon didn't write the screenplay for this, but it does kind of remind me of something that he would write in any of his movies or shows. Now, as for Bolivar Trask, played by Peter Dinklage, who was known as Tyrion in Game of Thrones by then, I don't really find him that compelling of an adversary. I guess if you had to pick an adversary, besides Magneto, it would be him. He's basically someone who is really interested in mutant kind and wants to study them, but also recognizes the potential threat that they could pose. Similar to the original X-Men, and I think it's very in vain of what the X-Men comics are about. Not everybody in society is going to be sold on the notion of mutant kind wanting to coexist peacefully with humankind. So naturally, there's going to be people who will assume the worst of what they don't understand, or fearing what they don't understand. It's kind of like how we see certain minority groups being marginalized in society right now. And you don't have to read too many history books to find more groups just like that. But I've never really been wowed by the character of Bolivar Trask. I mean, He gets the job done in this movie, but he's really there to be the poster child of people in society who feel skeptical about the place of mutant kind in the world. Kind of like what the Senator was in the original X-Men movies, but as opposed to that character, Trask doesn't really experience a sense of change by the end of the movie. So I guess maybe he does serve a purpose. I don't really need to see that repeated all the time, but he doesn't really have much character. I don't really think that's a negative necessarily, but if I had to pick anything that I didn't really feel sold on, it would probably be that aspect alone. But the rest of the guys manage to make their way back to Xavier's mansion, and Charles starts to get his powers back when the drugs wear off. And they decide it's time, in order to find Raven, to use Cerebro again, leading us to the best scene in the entire movie, where young Charles talks to older Charles by connecting through Logan's consciousness. And because he doesn't really trust himself or believe in himself anymore, Charles has a hard time using Cerebro, and in fact it almost rips him apart. But Logan manages to get through to him by saying, look, you did the same thing for me a long time from now. I don't know how to do that for you, but I know someone who might. And then he looks into Logan's mind and is able to talk to his future self. Amidst all of the flashy costume comic book stuff, really at the core of this movie is about hope. And everybody does need a little help sometimes, at least once. The arc that Charles Xavier experiences, I think, is very effective in how he manages to find his way again. And Logan manages to do for Charles what Charles did for him in the original films. Xavier was the coach the first time around, now he's the player. That's why I'm okay with Logan being the main focus of this movie. He is the main character, yes, but he's the one that we've gotten to know the most throughout this franchise so far, at this point at least in the series. So I think it's perfectly fine for him to be the audience character once again. And I gotta say, just like with Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy sells the hell out of this. Doesn't do it in an insufferable way to beg the audience for sympathy, especially after the last couple of years of experiencing certain hardships. I never did any drugs or anything, but as far as him feeling like he's lost everything, in a way, I do feel his pain. So Charles manages to use Cerebro again by reaching out to Raven. Of course, she is resisting his attempts to rein her back in. She wants to be able to make her own choices, and she feels like that Charles is holding her back. And I guess even for her, Eric was just too much to handle. And they only share maybe a couple of scenes together, but the one scene where she holds him at knife point really says it all about why their dynamic fell apart in the first place. To rewind back to Jennifer Lawrence's portrayal, what she experiences here is that she, like Charles, has lost her way in life. After feeling like she couldn't really be herself around Charles, Eric promised her something better, but even she started to get tired of his set-in-his-own-ways attitude. She feels like she doesn't really have anybody to connect with, and that she's now on her own. Hence why I think that this is the best use of the character in all of the X-Men movies. She has her place in the original three, but I think that as far as the characterization goes, Days of Future Past has the best use of it. Also, I have to point out, this wardrobe that Jennifer Lawrence is wearing right here, where she's talking to Charles in the airport, looks very similar to Stevie Nicks, doesn't it? As a fan of Stevie Nicks, that was certainly a bonus in my book. Hey Hollywood, could you get Jennifer Lawrence one day to play Stevie Nicks in a biopic? I'd go see that without question. I also want to point out the movie's aesthetic. As opposed to its predecessor, First Class, this one takes place in the early 1970s, and I think it feels a lot more lived in than its predecessor did, which felt very clean and fresh. Not that you didn't have certain environments like that in the 60s, I'm sure, but it didn't really feel like you were there in the 1960s. At least on my end, it didn't feel like that. But with Newton Thomas Siegel's cinematography, I think they managed to capture the lived-in sense of certain areas that the characters are sitting in, like Hank McCoy's surveillance room where he's watching the news, or watching an episode of the original Star Trek. Watching it, and I thought, oh my god, that's Captain Kirk! It would be remiss of me not to mention the balancing of certain characters, especially a lot of side characters like Alex Summers and Toad, Warpath, Bishop, people that don't really need to have as much focus as opposed to some of the others. I know a lot of X-Men fans would like to see a movie focus on them for a change. We might get that in the future when the MCU brings them in full front and center. You never know. On the surface, it might seem very cluttered and messy, but Simon Kinberg's writing wisely knows how much focus to give each of these people and knows exactly what the primary focus should be. I'm obviously not an expert on screenwriting, but I would imagine it's probably not an easy thing to accomplish. In this case, I think they managed to knock it out of the park. And of course, in vain of Charles's hopeful nature, he refuses to give up on the idea that Raven could change. And at the climax of the movie, when we see Richard Nixon presenting the Sentinels, and then they start to go crazy by shooting at everybody since they can detect the mutant gene, well, thanks to Magneto's sabotaging of the technology, and being a spokesman to all the mutants who feel marginalized by society, manages to win the approval of guys like Toad or all the other people besides Alex Summers, possibly to start a revolution of some kind. And of course, Raven gets the drop on him by almost killing Bolivar Trask in the underground bunker. And while all this is going on, we are constantly cutting back to the future in 2023 when all the other mutants are fighting off the Sentinels that are coming in after they're being discovered. And it doesn't really feel like it's messy. I think it's all working in conjunction with each other to show just how dour and scary and hopeless the situation is becoming. And can I just say, seeing Ian McKellen stand like this, I cannot be the only one who wasn't saying, "You cannot pass!" And before I forget, when he manages to get inside the building and has this moment with Charles, beautiful moment. Always gets me in the right ways. But then, of course, we get the most important moment of all. When Mystique has her gun trained at Trask, Charles manages to get inside her head, leaving it up to her and whether or not she's going to kill Trask anyway.
I've been trying to control you ever since the day we met. And look where that's got us. Everything that happens now is in your hands.
She doesn't fully forgive Charles, but was enough for her to let her anger go. And just as all this is happening in slow motion when she drops the gun on the ground and then everything just fades away. I've watched this movie only a couple times, but even now, I still feel a sense of catharsis. Then we get to the future in 2023, which is a better future. Just like when Marty wakes up in 1985 after he's returned, his family has changed for the better. Wolverine has a similar situation here, and Charles is the only one who knows exactly what's going on with Logan when he reveals certain details. Kind of makes me wonder, what exactly was happening with Logan during that 50-year time span? Another time travel logistic that, when you start to really think about it, it may or may not fall apart at the seams for some people. I'm able to let that go, but if some other people are not going to be sold on it, well, okay, that's on them. And also, to rewind back to the beginning, I would have liked some explanation as to what Mystique was up to during that time. You could say that maybe she had been killed by the Sentinels, because you could have easily brought her back in to stop her past self from doing all those things. But then again, she probably wouldn't have been able to survive that trip anyway. So Logan was the only one who was able to survive all that. Not a deal breaker for me, but I don't think it would have hurt. But this ending is really in vain with a couple of moments that were established beforehand. Like when Charles looks into Logan's mind and he sees what his future will become, he's so taken aback that he practically screams, "I don't want your future." And when Logan asks him to take care of Jean and Cyclops and him, Logan, when the time comes for them to show up at their school, it's in a way, I think, of reassuring the audience that the future is going to turn out for the better. And the fact that they've managed to correct everything, they've wiped out all the movies from existence now, including the first two X-Men movies. So now it's First Class, Days of Future Past, Apocalypse, and Dark Phoenix. I mean, thankfully they have acknowledged that the first two X-Men movies are canon, but the timeline just got so messy that they just couldn't keep up with everything that was changing. So Bryan Singer, I think, was really brave in making that sacrifice by saying, no, we gotta wipe the whole slate clean. It's the only way to really save it. There's a lot of stuff that I'm not even mentioning, and I'm probably going to be here all day if I'm going to go into all the details about that stuff. I don't really have that much to complain about with Days of Future Past. I think this is about as close to perfect as you can get from an X-Men movie, besides Logan and X-Men 2. The right balancing of all the major characters that are involved, a very effective look at hope and how it can really bring out the best in people and put people back on a better path once again when they lose their way. And I think in its own ways, it was a really good celebration of the franchise at that time. If you ask me though, this, along with Logan, should have been the end of the X-Men series. We'll talk about Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix at a later time. It should have ended right here, along with Logan. Yeah, I said it. Those are my thoughts on Days of Future Past. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie if you've seen it. And as always, see you in the next one.